Queer theory is designed in part to give us a robust and self-aware language with which to unsettle the putatively solid bonds that join chromosomal sex to gender to sexuality.
And when you mention heterosexuality as the norm in culture, why do you think that is?
It's hard to know. It's one of the things that the sort of founders of queer theory in the 1980s and 1990s, which remember that queer theory as a discipline, a university discipline, is still relatively young. And the individuals, the thinkers and activists who created queer theory at the beginning were all very interested in how it is that heteronormativity, the normalization, the ferocious and repeated normalization of heterosexual life, how did that come to be? It's very difficult to say, but we know that it did come into a kind of force at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. So it has a kind of beginning that coincides roughly with a number of other changes characterizing the modern world. So that heteronormativity, the normalization of heterosexual life, as we understand it, is a relatively recent phenomena. And historians of culture, historians of sexuality have demonstrated that you can go back to the mid-18th century, but before that you're really describing a very different kind of terrain. So it's a relatively new phenomenon.
Some of the complexities you did mention, the in-betweens of gay, lesbian, transgendered. Can you maybe give an example of those complexities within themselves and their identity?
Gay life is inflected by all sorts of things. It isn't simply a question of sexual interest or object choice, as it's sometimes called, as if it were a choice. Sexuality can be inflected by your class, by your ethnicity. In other words, that How to Be Gay, which is the title of a very interesting book right now, just recently published. The answer to that question is there's lots of ways of being gay, no single way of being gay. And thank goodness for that. And I think one of the great things about queer theory is that it helps all of us, gay or not, to understand just how complicated, how wonderfully complicated gay life is. And Michel Foucault, said that we live in an age, one of the characteristics of modernity, of the modern age, is that we put such unusual emphasis on the answer to those questions. Are you a man or a woman? Are you straight or gay? And as Foucault pointed out, that's a relatively recent obsession. One doesn't have to go very far back into European culture to see that in earlier ages, going back to Latin and classical antiquity, for example, those weren't the ways in which people identified. People identified themselves in very different ways, rather than simply answering the question, what are you, meaning, are you gay or straight? Are you a man or a woman? I think these ideas have the kind of hold on us that they do because they are abstractions. And Michel Foucault helped us understand that abstractions have an unusual power over us. What he called regulatory ideals. So the ideal, any given culture's ideal of what it is to be feminine or masculine, for example, those ideals are circulating in the culture, and we're expected to mimic or act out, as it were, those ideals. Let's take the example of gay marriage. Wonderful. Everyone should be allowed to be married, of course. It seems to me absolutely absurd and sickening in its own way, from my point of view, that anyone could object to anyone marrying anyone else. It just boggles the mind that there could be such things. But as some queer theorists have pointed out, there's a certain way in which the insistence on gay marriage is a kind of heterosexual colonization of queer life, which is to say that marriage is, to a certain extent, a heteronormative phenomenon, very closely linked to heteronormativity. It's so important when you teach a course in queer theory and critical practice never to inadvertently teach the class as if somehow queers were elsewhere, as if somehow the teacher standing in front of them wasn't queer, as if somehow the student sitting next to you wasn't queer. It's so important to teach a class and encourage everyone in that class to realize that this is not a theoretical abstraction. We're not talking about human beings that you read about in the newspaper. We're talking about real people and the people that are in the course, fellow students. And it's really important for students, queers and non-queers alike, to see that within any given classroom, there's all different ways of being human, all different ways of living a desirous life. We just need a much better vocabulary with which to understand how complicated that life is.